Hello, lovely viewers. You are most welcome to our channel Poetry Online. In this video, we shall be discussing the detailed analysis of Weep Not Child by ngugi wa thiong'o. Kindly subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to get updates on all our new videos. Once again, let us assure you of a very interesting discussion. Get ready for this lesson. Let us begin today's lesson by first knowing the main characters in the story. Ngoto. Ngozo is the head of the family in the story. Ngozo works as a laborer on the land which his father once owned, but which the British gave to a white settler. Ngozo fought with the British Army in the First World War, which is referred to in the story as the Big War. Ngozo has two wives, Iyeri and Iyokabi. He has three sons by Iyeri and two sons by Iyokabi. Iyeri is Ngoto's first wife. Ngoto has three sons with Iyeri, Boro, Kori, Kamau. He also has two sons with his wife Iyokabi. Iyokabi is his second wife, and their children are Nwangi and Njorigi. Boro. Boro is Ngoto's eldest son by his first wife, Iyeri. Boro fought for the British in the Second World War. He came back from the war a bitter and angry man. He has left home and has gone to Nairobi to look for work. Boro does not respect his father because Ngoto works as a laborer on the land which his father once owned. Kori. Kori is Boro's brother. He also left home and gone to find work in Nairobi. Kamau. Kamau is Nyorige's youngest son. He has stayed at home and is learning to become a carpenter. His wages help to support the family. Nwangi. Nwangi is Ngoto's son by his second wife, Iyokabi. Nwangi was killed while fighting for the British in the Second World War. Njorigi. Njorigi is the main character in the story. He is Ngoto's youngest son by his wife, Iyokabi. Jacobo. Jacobo has done well out of colonial rule. He is wealthy and is ready to help the British so that he can keep his land and his wealth. Mr. Holland uses Jacobo in his fight against the black people. Onwahaki. Onwahaki is Jacobo's daughter. She makes friends with Njorigi and falls in love with him. The unhappy love affair between Wahaki and Njorigi is a central part of the story. Mr. Holland. Mr. Holland is a white settler who farms on the land which once belonged to Ngoto's father. He loves his farm and is determined that no one shall take it from him. His hatred for the black people increases as the struggle for freedom becomes fiercer. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's now discuss the historical background and ngugi wa thiong'o's recreation of Kenyan history. By the end of this section, viewers, you will be expected to have a vivid understanding of the following: the dominant position of white settlers in Kenya by the early 1950s, the position of the Indian settlers, how the Second World War changed those Africans who fought in it, how the Mau Mau fighters were regarded by the ordinary Kenyan. Let's now consider the historical background. The emergence in Kenya. Ngugi wa thiong'o's novel has its background the years preceding the emergency in Kenya, as well as the period of the emergency itself, which lasted from October 1952 to December 1959. The period is also known as the Mau Mau Rebellion, although the term Mau Mau was not used by the fighters themselves and was probably coined by the enemies of the freedom fighters in the bid to give the struggle a savage and atavistic aspect. During the early 20th century, the central highlands of Kenya, which was ancestral Kikuyu land, was settled by British and other European farmers. These settlers soon became wealthy growers of coffee and tea, while the Gikuyu were black or peasant farmers who lived on small parcels of land sold to them by the white farmers. The majority of Africans, in fact, became landless. Furthermore, to protect their interests, the settlers banned the growing of coffee and tea by Africans and confined them to less lucrative crops, and also imposed a hard tax on the Africans. Tired of having its grievances ignored, the African community, especially the Gikuyu, one of Kenya's largest ethnic groups, gradually moves towards more radical actions. There was some outbreak of violence in 1951, and then, in the following year, the secret society, known as the Mau Mau, began a campaign of violence against Europeans and other Africans considered as traitors. Let's now discuss Ngugi wa Thiong'o's recreation of Kenyan history. Ngugi wa Thiong'o turns history into fiction by his combined use of certain characters, plots, and of course, point of view. Weep Not Child is set in a small African village called Mahua, which lies next to the town called Kipanga, situated on the main road which runs through the ridges and valleys of Gikuyu land all the way to Nairobi. The setting is used by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, first of all, to make the readers aware of the unfair distribution of land imposed by the colonial administration. It says, the first two valleys went to the country of the black people. The other two divided the land of the black people from the land of the white people. You could tell the land of the black people because it was red, roughly, and sickly, while the land of the white people was green and not lacerated into small strips. The unfair distribution of land, and therefore of wealth, which places the Africans in vastly inferior position to the white settlers, is complicated by the presence of the Indian community, who seemed to control mercantile activity in the small town. The Indian shops were many. The Indian traders were said to be very rich. They too employed some black boys, who they treated as nothing. The Indian feared Europeans, and if you went to buy in a shop and a white man found you, the Indian would stop selling to you and, trembling all over, would begin to serve him. Ngugi wa Thiong'o tells us that there are other shops too, built in two rows facing one another, noisy and smelling strongly of burning meat, where the unemployed youth are to be seen hanging around, waiting for errands that might earn them a day's meal. For the Africans, the focus of social life is the barber shop, where the men gather when they were not working to hear stories about the Second World War and the latest news about the political developments in the big city. The impact of the historical developments in the country is conveyed by Ngugi wa Thiong'o through what happens to the three families of Ungoto, Jacobo, and Holland, who represent the three major classes of Kenyan society. In a narrative strategy that is both economical and powerful, almost the entire social history of Kenya in the 1950s is expressed through the three families. Ngoto's family represents the landless majority of Africans in Kenya are readily radicalized and absorbed into fighting to reclaim their lost land, as happened with Boro and others. The people at this level of the society are obliged to make precarious living as laborers of white farmers who pay them very poorly. Above this class are the land-owning Africans who are represented in the novel by the Jacobo family. Jacobo, as you would have noticed, is not permitted to grow tea or coffee, which is a preserve of the white farmers. Jacobo grows paritrom, a less profitable crop, which nevertheless makes him a wealthy man by African standard. This novel makes it clear that it is not only Jacobo among the Africans who own land. Nganga the carpenter also owns a piece of land and therefore considered rich by the Africans. This man is, however, not a farmer, probably because the land is too small or the soil is too poor to support profitable agriculture, assuming he could find the necessary capital for such a venture. At the top of the social ladder is Mr. Hollands, representing the white settler farmers who owned not only the best of land, but owned it in large estates, on which they grew coffee or tea, and offered miserly employment to the original settlers of the land, thus the Africans in Kenya. The plot of the novel is Ngugi wa Thiong'o's way of demonstrating how this horribly unjust arrangement evolved historically into a violent confrontation. In other words, the plot of the novel often imitates the logic of social development, showing how things change in the society. Ngoto's family, it will appear, are content to struggle to survive in their miserable poverty, placing their only hope in their younger son, whose education will lift them out of poverty. Jacobo is already securing middle class life for his children, who will eventually inherit his farm. As for Holland, his only worry is whether his remaining son will agree to inherit the opulent farm and the land which he Holland believes to be his property by right. But as Ngugi wa Thiong'o sees it, change is coming, whether the three men at the head of the families see it or not. This change is motivated by the unhappiness and the misery of the exploited laborers and workers, and is propelled more forcefully by the anger of the young men like Boro, who had fought for the white men in the Second World War and certainly do not believe in the assumed superiority of the Europeans. It is these young men, unable to tolerate the injustice at home, will take to the forest and persuade others to do the same, as in the case of Boro. Ngugi wa Thiong'o shows that the rebellion was fueled by anger of dissatisfied Africans. Ngugi wa Thiong'o's novel concludes as a near tragedy. This is because he wants through the characters and the plot to show the disastrous consequences of the rebellion. All three families are destroyed by the events that take place in the community. They may not have realized it, but the families shared a common destiny in the Kenyan nation. It was blind for the Hollandese and the Jacobos to believe that they will live on in prosperity, while the Ngotos were kept down in desperate poverty. However, the path of Kenyan history, as Ngugi wa Thiong'o charts it in the novel, does not end in a totally hopeless destination. In the end, the dreamer, Njoroge, wakes up to the burden of responsibility for his two mothers. He has to rebuild his life for the sake of his mothers, whom he now must look after, and like Nwahaki, he too must wait and hope for a new day. The story of Kenyan, as Ngugi wa Thiong'o presents it, does not end with the death and destruction brought about by the emergency. The nation, as represented by the youth in the novel, will wake up to a new, more caring, and more responsible day. Let's now discuss the point of view employed by Ngugi wa Thiong'o. The point of view is a device which Ngugi wa Thiong'o employs successfully in the story of the account of the Kenyan history. While the novel employs a third-person narrative, many of the events are recounted as Njoroge sees them or feels about them. Indeed, to a large extent, Weep Not Child is Njoroge's story. Consider the moments in the story when Nganga, to whom Kamau has been apprenticed as a carpenter, unexpectedly reveals a general side of his character. Ngoso was given a place to build by Nganga. It was then that Njoroge realized that the man's rough exterior and apparent lack of scruple concealed a warm heart. His old hatred for Nganga vanished. Even Kamau could now speak of him with enthusiasm. Because the story is largely about the mental development of Njoroge, the narrator tends to present events at the level of his understanding. This means that there is a deliberate simplicity about the way history is presented. We can illustrate this by the way in which an important element of the history of Kenya is presented in the novel. The Mama Rebellion was, of course, a major development in the historical evolution of Kenya, which led to some several years of violence in which thousands of Africans were killed. When the Mau Mau rebellion comes up again for discussion among Njorige and his friends, the unqualified adulteration of his leader has mirrored somewhat the killing of people by both the forest guards and home guards has created fear and uncertainty. He says, the home guards with the white masters, they are as bad as Mau Mau. No, Mau Mau is not bad. The freedom boys are fighting against white settlers. Is it bad to fight for one's land? Tell me that. But they cut black men's throats. Those killed are traitors, black white settlers. What is Mau Mau? Njoroge asked. He had never known what it was, and his curiosity overcame his fear of being thought ignorant. Karanja, who was just joined the group, said it was a secret kiyama. You drink oath, you become a member. The kiyama has its own soldiers who are fighting for the land. Kimanti is the leader, not Jomo. Not Jomo. A small boy with one bad eye asked. I don't know, Karanja continued. But father says Kimanti is a leader of the Freedom Army and Jomo is a leader of KAU. I like KAU and fear Mau Mau. Obviously, the view of the Mau Mau rebellion is from the perspective of boys who at this point of the story are quite removed from the activities of the movement, but who do not express total support or admiration for the fighters and are rather afraid of the movement for killing of apparently innocent victims. Our final view of the Mau Mau is a close-up of one of the major fictional leaders, Boro. Our view of this leader comes directly from the third person narrator and is not filtered through the perception of Njorige or any of his juvenile friends. In the first of these final scenes, Boro, in a conversation with one of his lieutenants in the forest army, makes it clear that he believes in nothing except revenge, and that even though freedom and the recovery of the land are fine ideals, these are quite meaningless to him, as this cannot restore his brother, Unwangi, whom he lost in the Second World War. We see Boro, the Mau Mau leader, for the first time in the scene in which he kills Hollands. Here too, Boro is presented as a cold and feeling killing machine who expresses no color of hatred, anger, or triumph, no sympathy. Boro is presented as motivated by lofty ideals. He is a man who has lost his humility as a result of a long history of injustice. We conclude this section with a summary of the main points of Ngugi wa Thiong'o's presentation of history. As we observed earlier, the author employs point of view to present history as seen from the perspective of the ordinary people. There is little in the way the editorial commentary from the narrator as to why the Mau Mau did what they did. The only comments come from Njorigi and his companions. We have also noted that by the setting of his novel in a remote village in the heart of Gikuyu, Ngugi wa Thiong'o reinforces the simplicity of the story he tells, in which the politics of this country is filtered through the conversation at the barber shop. We notice that the author selects his characters to represent the three main contenders for the land in the Kenyan: the landless and impoverished, the landed, and the relatively wealthy African minority, and the majority white settler farmer who was backed by the colonial government. Finally, we noted how the author uses plot to structure his account of Kenyan history as a movement from hope to almost total despair, but with a hint on the possibility of a revival at the very end. Welcome to section 2 of our analysis of Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Weep Not Child. In this section, we shall examine the social life of the community that author presents to us in the novel, and how that life is changed by the emergency. We shall study how the members of the community relate to one another within the family and in the wider town and at school. The viewers will be expected at the end of this section to be able to demonstrate knowledge of how the lives of the different classes of Kenyans were directly affected by the emergency, as shown in the changes to the families of Ngoto, Jacobo, and Hollands. Boro's rebellion and what he represents, the antagonism felt towards the Indians by the Africans. The very opening scene of the novel thrusts the readers into the family of Ngoto, where Njorigi has been informed by his mother that he will be given a fabulous opportunity to go to school. In that scene, the two facts which the artist underlines about the family are its extreme poverty and the warm closeness of its members. Njorigi, of course, is overjoyed with the news that he will be going to school. The fact that his family cannot afford to provide him with a midday meal, which most other people should probably be enjoying, does not in the least dampen his enthusiasm. He is especially thrilled that, in addition to the education he'll be receiving, he will for the first time be wearing a shirt and a pair of shorts. Until that moment, he has had nothing but a piece of calico to cover his nakedness. Njorigi cannot wait to share the news with his older brother, actually his half-brother Kamau, and it is the eldest brother's response when Njorigi expresses regret that Kamau cannot go to school with him, which underscores the love that prevails in Ngoto's family. His elder brother responds by saying, "Don't worry about me. Everything will be alright. Get education. I'll get carpentry. Then we shall in the future be able to have a new and better home for the whole family." Ngoto, as a husband and father, is the source of joy that prevails in his homestead. Ngoto guides his home with a loving hand. When we first meet him, he is enjoying the meal company at the barber's shop. He however tears himself away from the fun because he does not want to upset his two wives, Iyeri and Iyokabi, for whom he has bought equal portions of meat, not wanting to stir up jealousy. But although he is a considerate husband, he does share a fair harbor of a traditional male prejudice. He knew that his two wives liked each other and were good companions and friends, but he could not quite trust women. They were fickle and very jealous. When a woman was angry, no amount of beating would pacify her. Ngoto did not beat his wives much. On the contrary, his home was well known for being a place of peace. All the same, one had to be careful. Such is the tenderness of Ngoto's relationship with his wives that they are able to tease him about how quick he has been and returning from work. Indeed, we discover that this is a family in which the sons can tease their mothers and the mothers their husband in front of their children. We learn that many young men from Mahua Ridge usually gather in the heart of Ngoto's first wife, Iyeri, to shorten the night by telling stories. Storytelling being a favorite form of nighttime entertainment, Ngoto himself is a good storyteller, and it is in one of these story sessions that he recounts the creation myth of Gikuyu and Mambi, and the myth which confers ownership of Gikuyu lands onto the Gikuyu people. He also recounts the prophecy of Muguwa Kiberu, the Gikuyu seer, who foretold the eventual return of the land to its rightful owners. Ngoto's homestead served as a kind of social center for the Mahua Ridge, where people, especially young men, come to entertain themselves with stories and learn about their ancestral laws. But in the gathering of young men, there is one who is distinguished from the others by his anger and impatience with the old ways. The young man is Boru. In him, the reader sees the first sign in the heart of Ngoto's very traditional home of the change that is to come. Boru's response to his father's enthralling story is one of impatient rejection. As he listened to this story, all these things came into his mind with growing anger. How could these people have let the wise man occupy the land without acting? In a whisper, which sounded like a shout, he said, "To hell with the prophecy." Yes, it was nothing more than a whisper. To his father, he said, "How can you continue working for a man who has taken your land? How can you go on serving him?" He walked out without waiting for an answer. Social life in the community at the opening of the novel is not confined to the evenings in Ngoto's homestead. For the men, there is also the barber shop in town, where the best gossips may be heard. Like Boro, the barber has been a soldier in the big war, but has not been soured by the experiences. Instead, the war provided him with adventure, which he holds his audience captive. While Africans, as he claims, were only allowed to be porters in the First World War, he and others also served in the Second World War, where they carried guns and shot white men. White men? Yes, they were not the guns we had taught them to be. We even slept with their women. Ha! How are they? Not different. Not different. I like a good flashy black body with sweat. But they are, you know, so thin, without flesh, nothing. With this kind of salacious talk, it is small wonder that the barber holds his men captive. When Ngoto leaves the shop, he can't help wondering if the barber's story about white men is true. After Ngoto's brave but rash attack on the traitor Jacobo, it is at the barber shop that the community assesses the old man's bravery, and the verdict is that not only is Ngoto courageous, but has acted as a true African child. As for Jacobo, he is condemned by the gathering as a selfish man who does not want his fellow Africans to become rich like him. The barber shop in the novel serves as a forum of African public opinion, as if to establish a deliberate contrast between Ngoto's homestead, which is happy and sociable, the homes of the more affluent men of the community. Neither Jacobo nor Holland seem to be run in particularly warm households. Jacobo seems to have been a successful man with the education of his children. His son John is set to go abroad for further studies. His daughter Lucia is a teacher, and in Oaxaca is in school with Njorigi. Jacobo also has small children who are too young to be in school. However, the author does not offer a glimpse into the family to enable readers to see how they relate to one another. One can only guess from Oaxaca's almost total attachment to Njorigi towards the end of the novel that she is not as close to her family as Njorigi is to his. The gulf between Jacobo's family and the wider African community is indicated by the disastrous party to which Jacobo's wife, Juliana, invites the children of her husband's workers. During Juliana's excessively long grace, Njorigi says the other children giggling, and they end up receiving a lecture on the importance of good manners. As for Holland, he is not only removed from the African community, he is isolated from the members of his own family. His life is entirely dedicated to his farm. Even his wife mattered only if so far as she made it possible for him to work it more efficiently without a worry about home, for he left the management of home to her and knew nothing about what happened there. Howlands has brought his wife Susanna to Kenya simply to satisfy his natural sexual needs. As he says, he could not go about with the natives as some had done. But once he gets his wife to accompany him to Kenya, he proceeds to ignore her and devotes all his energies to his farm, while she consoles herself with the son she soon bears and with the beating of African servants. For a while, as his son grows up, Hollands becomes something of a family man, walking through the farm with his son, happy to have someone to whom he can one day leave the farm. Unfortunately, his son is called to the World War and is killed. We are told that, but for the farm, Holland would have destroyed himself, though he is blessed with another son, Stephen, and with another older daughter, who has turned missionary. Holland is essentially a lonely man. He lives entirely for his farm and cannot be said to be happy. There is also another community of Indians who own bigger shops in Kipanga. The Indians are said to be rich and to employ some African boys who they treated as nothing. One of them has once employed Ngoto and has deliberately held back a month's pay, which Ngoto, when he leaves in dissatisfaction, is obliged to forfeit. Naturally then, there is much antagonism between Africans and the sly Indians. Njorige remembers a gesture of unexpected kindness when an Indian child gives him a sweet. He accepts the sweet only to incur the wrath of his mother. Is it that you have not eaten anything for a whole year? Are you to be greedily taking anything you are given by anyone, even a dirty little Indian? Njorige threw it away, but it had hurt him because the boy saw him do it. He both ached and feared to go back and tell something, but he did not then go. Days later, he went to the same shop. The boy was not there. It thus appears that the hatred of Indians is passed down from parents to their children among the Africans. School for Njorigi becomes the most significant social institution and the place where he forms important relationships of his life outside the family. Onwahaki, the youngest daughter of Jacobo, takes him to school and protects him against the older boys who want to bully him, calling him Njuka. The two gradually form a bond which will persevere through the turbulence of the emergency, even though Njorige's brother will be the one to murder Nwahaki's father. The relationship begins with their walking home after school and develops into a bond of love which they themselves do not quite understand. Njorigi also comes to admire and respect his teachers. There is a teacher nicknamed Yuyu who introduced Njorigi and his classmates to alphabet. This jovial character, who is said not to be a good Christian because he allegedly drinks and smokes and goes about with women, is later murdered during the emergency while leading a group of worshippers to a prayer meeting. The other teacher Njorigi gets to know is Lucia, Onwahaki's oldest sister, who teaches Njorigi beginner's English and is much frustrated by her slow-witted class. Teacher, very annoyed. Class, what is she doing? Class, singing. You are standing. Teacher, still more angry. I am asking you, what is she doing? Class, afraid, quietly singing. You are standing up. Teacher, look here, you stupid and lazy fools. How long do you take to catch things? Didn't we go all over this yesterday? If I come tomorrow and find that you make a single mistake, I will punish you severely. Njorige himself is a rather quiet student who spends a great deal of his time in the school, sitting by himself in a corner, but who does well in his studies. Apart from Wahaki, he does not appear to have any real friend among his schoolmates. He is too much of a dreamer. At one moment in the story, Onwahaki is obliged to ask him, "Why do you keep alone? To avoid me?" And Njorige is ashamed. At Sierra Secondary School, Njorige seems more adjusted. He seems to be well liked and is teased by his classmates about his happiness during the English class and the less buoyant mood during math class. He is full of admiration for the devotion of the missionary teacher, who seems to treat all the people with respect, whether black or white, and is unable to see through the racism of the headmaster, who, believing that excellence can only come from the white man, brings up his African students to copy and cherish the white man's civilization as the only hope of mankind, and especially the black race. Njorigi sees Syriana as a center of learning that will enable him fulfill his unrealistic dreams of single-handedly delivering his country from injustice and poverty. The school for him is a place where he can meet God, not only in the cool shelter of the chapel, but also in the quietness of the library. To summarize this section, it is clear that ngugi wa thiong'o uses a wealth of detail to provide the readers with such a sense of living community. It is a society in which some members, the poor, live in the happy communal interaction. The Ngoto's family, representing the landless poor, are well integrated and supportive of each other. The well-to-do African, thus the Jacobo, and the wealthy farmer, thus the Hollands, do not seem to have the joy in their lives that characterizes the wealth they have acquired. Ngugi wa Thiong'o also underlines the importance of education to all levels of Kenyan society, but especially to the landless poor who see education as the only way out of poverty. Welcome to section 3 of our analysis of Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Weep-Not Child. In this section, we're going to concern ourselves with the development of Ngoto, Jacobo, and Hollands, and with their roles in the emergency. By the end of this section, you should be able to have a thorough understanding of the nature of Ngoto's attachment to the land and his transformation during the emergency, the different nature of Holland's attachment to the land, Jacobo's role as a pawn of the white settlers. All three of the major adult characters undergo a change or changes in the course of the story. Our concern in this section is to try to understand the forces which compel these characters to transform themselves, to ask ourselves whether or not we are to sympathize with them. For many readers, Ngoto, not Njoroge, is the hero of Weep-Not Child, where the term hero does not just mean the central character, but also the one who embodies the positive moral values of the work and who, despite his weaknesses, still attracts the reader's sympathy. As we have already noted, Ngoto at the beginning of the novel is a loving husband and a father whose homestead attracts the youth of the entire range. As we have noted, the catalyst that helps transform this gentle old man to the state of a hero is his own son, Boro. When his son tells him of being content to work as a laborer for a man who has taken his land, Ngoto begins to feel inadequate and feels the need to assert his manhood. And yet, Ngoto's apparent servility has an explanation. Believing in the prophecy of Muguwa Kibiro, he thinks the white man will one day go away and his land will be restored to him. This explains why he tends Holland's land so lovingly and why his attitude to nature in general is so passionate and sensitive. He believes the land is a gift to his ancestors from Murungu, which he is enjoined by God's commandment to till in serenity. Indeed, it would be appropriate to describe Ngoto's attitude to the land and to the farm as spiritual. There was one time when he had felt a desire to touch the dewdrop or open one and see what it held hidden inside. He had trembled like a child, but after he touched the drops, and they had quickly lost shape, melting into wetness, he felt ashamed and moved on. At times, he was thankful to Murungu for no apparent reason as he went through this cultivated field all alone. Holland notices the care that Ngoto bestows on the land and on the farm, and almost guesses correctly the reason for the old man's devotion, but not quite. Holland just loves to see Ngoto working on the farm, the way the old man touches the soil, almost fondly, and the way he tenders a young tea plant, as if they were his own. What Holland does not know is that Ngoto does not consider the farm and the land on which he is growing as Holland's own. Rather, he sees it as a responsibility to guard it for the dead, the living, and the unborn generation of his line. But for Boro, the old man would have been content to work for Holland until the prophecy's fulfillment. But his angry son changes all that. Ngoto, under pressure from his own son, feels he must be a man, and he must support the strike that has been called for the workers and laborers. As is to be expected, the incipient radicalization of the old man affects his role as a father and a husband. Njoroge comes from school one day to find his mother and his father quarreling, and his mother continues to rail at his father. The old man hits her across the face and raises his hand to do so again. Ngoto's conduct on the day of the strike makes him a hero in the eyes of the African community at the barber shop. He rushes to attack Jacobo, whom he sees as a traitor to the African cause. as he sees it at the gathering on the day of the strike. The battle was now between these two, Jacobo on the side of the white people and he on the side of the black people. As a result of his heroic action, he is badly hurt by the police and is thrown off Jacobo's land, where he had been living as a Muhoi. What is worse, his son Boro blames him for the failure of the strike. After all, it was meant to be peaceful, and his rash action on Holland had given the police an excuse to ward in and break it up. It is during the time of the failed strike that relation between Ngoto and Boro reaches their lowest point. Boro strives to make his father take the Mau oath, but the old man refuses. To take the oath from his own son would be contrary to Kikuyu custom, and so, even though he feels the loss of the land more keenly than Boro, he will not submit to his own son. The strife between father and son hurt the old man deeply, and to worsen his grief, it is at this time that Jomo Kenyatta, the great hope of the oppressed Africans, is arrested by the colonial masters. Ongoto's home was now a place where stories were no longer told, a place where no young men and women from the village gathered. When we next meet Ngoto in his detention, haunted by the feeling that he failed his children, he surrenders to Holland in an effort to take on the punishment for the murder of Jacobo. In prison, he is tortured in all manner of ways, and it is as a totally broken man that he is released by Holland, who has known all along that the real murderer is Boro. The death of Ngoto is also his moment of triumph. Released from the home guard post, he is physically a wreck as a result of the torture he has endured. He is however still tormented by a sense of inadequacy as a father. When Njoroge comes to see him, the old man thinks his son has come to mock him. Finally, Boro comes impertinent in the acknowledgement that the old man has been tortured for the crime he committed. "Forgive me, father," Boro pleaded. "I didn't know." Finally, there is a reconciliation between father and son, and the dying patriarch is transformed again into the pillar he was once of his homestead. Ngoto exerted himself and sat up in bed. He lifted his hand with an effort and put it on Boro's head. Boro looked like a child, commanding Boro to fight well and bidding Njoroge to take care of his two mothers. Ngoto finally dies a hero. He dies a revolutionary, accepting the necessity of the struggle to reclaim the lost land. More than any other character, he deserves the reader's respect and sympathy. If Ngoto is arguably the hero of the novel, Holland is a supreme villain, or at least one of its villains. But such is the intelligence of the author that, instead of presenting the white settler as a flat cardboard figure of evil, he makes him at least initially a person with good motives that the readers understand, even if they cannot completely agree with them. Disillusionment with European civilization is what brings Holland to Africa. As a young man in England, he has gone with enthusiasm to fight in the First World War and has been horrified by the blood and destruction. Back home, after the war, he has found the peacetime condition in England absolutely unbearable. Needing to escape, he had come to Africa, a wild continent asking to be conquered. But Holland's assumption, which he shared with thousands of other disillusioned Europeans, that Africa was an empty space, begging for European occupation, was a dishonest pretense. In the case of the Hollands, the land he occupies is Ngoto's ancestral land. It is for this reason that the destinies of the two men are inevitably linked. The author goes to great pain to contrast Holland's attitude to the land with that of Ngoto's attitude. His attitude to the land, as we have noticed, is that it is a sacred heritage which he must guard and preserve for the future generation. For Holland, however, the land is something he must conquer, in the same way that a man must tame a wild animal and put it to profitable use. And just as the man may say, the animal he has tamed is his property, So Holland believes that the land he has conquered and made fruitful is his property, his by right of conquest. His logic is the typical logic of the imperialist, and he believes it passionately. This is why he is outraged when Ngoto asks if he is going back home to England. "My home is here," is his emphatic response. We must be fair to Holland. He is a hard-working man, but then, so is Ngoto. We are told that Holland never sleeps much, and unlike his wife, is always up early in the morning so that he can go to work on his beloved shamba, which he clearly loves more than his wife. His life and soul were in the shamba, we are told. Ngugi wa Thiong'o carefully underlines the individualism of Holland's claim to the land. Ngoto, you will recall, regards himself as a mere trustee of the land that is not his personal property. Not so Holland. Mr. Holland always felt a certain amount of victory whenever he walked through it all. He alone was responsible for taming this unoccupied wilderness. The two sentences above truly capture the essence of Holland, who believes himself to be the sole conqueror and therefore owner of the once empty and savage land. He does not recognize the contribution of his wife, let alone that of his workers. For Holland, therefore, is an impudent disruption of the order he has created for himself, and he will do anything necessary to re-establish that order. If the Mau Mau rebellion think they can drive him back to England, they are mistaken. His sole reason for accepting the position of district officer is to help defend his land. His involvement is for purely personal reason. He hates the fact that the strike and the emergency have made him move out of his shell and assume a public life, something he has come to detest since he left Europe and since the death of his beloved first son in the Second World War. Who were black men and Mau Mau anyway? He asked the 1,000th time. Mere savages, a nice word, savages. Previously, he had not thought of them as savages or otherwise, simply because he had not thought of them all at all, except as part of the farm, the way one thought of donkeys or horses in the farm, except that in the case of donkeys or horses, one had to think of their food and a place for them to sleep. The emergency clearly brings out the unexpected racism of Holland and who feels more responsibility towards his animals than his laborers. He finds it unthinkable that creatures who are no better than animals should challenge his way of life. Defeating them will bring him to satisfaction, akin to the satisfaction of conquering the land. This explains the viciousness with which he performs his role as district officer. He has no feelings for Africans as human beings and feels he is defending his way of life he secures for himself through his individual strength. The question of sending his family back to England does not arise. Thus, Africa is his home. Even the manner of Holland's death is consistent with his perverse logic and could be regarded as heroic if it were not to be profoundly misguided. Facing certain death at the hands of Boro, Holland insists that this is my land. According to the narrator, he says this as a man would say, this is my woman. That is, as something one possesses passionately. When Boro shoots him, Holland's trunk stands, defiant for a few seconds, before falling. There is indeed something courageous about Holland's death, but his courage is founded on and is a defense of the cruel injustice. He fails to win the reader's sympathy unless the reader supports what he stands for. Jacobo in many ways, the least admirable of the three men. He is an African who, having attained a measure of success, turns his back on his fellow Africans and becomes a pawn in the hands of the white settlers. His role in the strike is shameful when seen from the African perspective. But even more disgraceful is his role as a chief of the Home Guards, whose duty is to report on fellow Africans for the benefits of the Europeans. The white man for whom he works for has no respect for him whatsoever. Hollands looked at his watch. It looked small in his hand. He was expecting the chief. Mr. Holland despised Jacobo because he was a savage, but he could use him. The very ability to set people fighting amongst themselves instead of fighting the white man gave an amused satisfaction. But as usual, with Ngugi wa Thiong'o, even the treacherous Jacobo is shown to have a sympathetic side. This is shown when he surprises Njoroge and his daughter Nwahaki in his home and shows interest in Njoroge's education, saying, "I hope you do well. It is such as you who must work hard and rebuild the country." Njoroge noticed that, at the moment, Jacobo looks tired and is not the proud farmer of old. In summary, we notice that, of the three characters, Jacobo seems to be the one with the least convincing reason, morally, for what he does. Ngoso changes from a peaceful husband and father he is at the beginning of the novel because he feels challenged by his son, especially Boro. Holland unleashes a suppressed monster in him because he feels his life's achievement is threatened by the people he regards as savages. Jacobo betrays his people because of greed and selfishness, and because he is too stupid to realize that he is being used by the white man. Welcome to our final analysis of Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Whipnut Child. In this section, we shall be examining the roles of the younger generation, Njoroge and Nwahaki, and to a lesser extent Stephen Holland. You will no doubt remember that, at the end of the novel, the older male characters, Ngoto, Jacobo, and Holland, are all dead, leaving the younger generation of characters to carry the burden of the future of their community. But how do these young characters behave during, before, and after the emergency, and what promise do they hold for the future? At the end of this section, you will be expected to be aware of the symbolic significance of the relationship between Njoroge, Nwahaki, and Stephen. Njoroge as a misguided dreamer who does not understand the reality of a situation. Nwahaki's stronger and more responsible personality. The relationship between these three people are of great symbolic significance. Njoroge's relationship to Nwahaki, though not forbidden by their parents, represents a coming together of the poor landless Africans and the wealthier landed Africans. In a sense, it is a triumph of natural attraction over social impediment, and it is to the credit of Jacobo that he does not reprimand his daughter or threaten Njoroge when he finds the two of them together in his house, especially given the history between him and Ngoto. Njoroge's insidious friendship with Stephen, which is not given a chance to develop, represents a possible bridge between the very poor and the very rich in the Kenyan society, and therefore the possibility of a greater racial and class harmony in future. Stephen tells that he will be going back to England to seek shelter from the violence of the emergency, but we can assume that with his father's death, he and his mother will be coming back to see the family property. Will he, as the owner of the Hollands farm, be more concerned about the welfare of his African workers and grant them better living conditions? This is a question Ngugi wa Thiong'o leaves unanswered. Towards the end of the novel, the narrator comes down very hard on Njoroge and exposes him bluntly as a young man who for most of the story has been out of touch with reality and who has exhibited a marked tendency to seek refuge in dreams. Njoroge has always been a dreamer, a visionary who had consoled himself, faced by the difficulties of the moment, by a look at a better day to come. A little later in the story, when his two mothers are inconsolable because his father is approaching death, the narrator again makes a remark which is very critical of Njoroge. For the first time, Njoroge was face to face with a problem to which tomorrow was no answer. It is perhaps useful to examine Njoroge's life in the light of these remarks from the narrator. What evidence is there to indicate that Njoroge indeed leads a life of illusion and is hardly in touch with reality? The young man is not alone in seeing education as the key to the future. Many boys of his generation and class held the same view. However, his isolation from his immediate environment, Jacobus' children, means that he is obliged to depend on books for companionship. And with the Bible as his favorite book, Njoroge sees development in his country through a biblical myth, which perhaps confuses his sense of reality. Njoroge came to place faith in the Bible, and with his vision of an educated life in the future, was blended a belief in the righteous God. Equity and justice were there in the world. If you did well and remained fruitful to your God, the kingdom of heaven was yours, and a man will get a reward from God. A bad man will harvest bad fruits. The tribal stories told by his mother has strengthened his belief in the virtue of toil and perseverance. Indeed, Njoroge's belief consists of a weird mixture of Christianity and Gikuyu folklore, which bears little relation to the problems confronting contemporary Kenya. How could anybody believe that justice and equity were there in the world given the glaring injustice that prevailed in the country? His belief in the future for his family and the village rested then not only on a hope of sound education, but also on a belief in a God of love and mercy who long walked on this earth with Gikuyu and Mambi, or Adam and Eve. And with all this, there was growing up in his heart a feeling that the Gikuyu people, whose land had been taken away by the whites, were no other than the children of Israel, about whom he had read in the Bible. The readers cannot help feeling that ngugi wa thiong'o is mocking Njoroge here, as somebody who has been misled by his education into holding beliefs that are irrelevant to the society and its problems. His identification of the Gikuyu people with the children of Israel in the Bible is fanciful and invalid. In practical terms, Njoroge's belief led to the kind of pacifism which even his own father rejects in the end. In effect, Njoroge is being educated to become an ally of the white man. Listening to people talk about Jomo Kenyatta, Njoroge feels that he already knows this man, that he has read about him in the Old Testament, and that Kenyatta is none other than Moses, who led the children of Israel from misery to the promised land. On the approach of the strike, he prays that the strike should be successful, that it should come soon, and bring his father a lot of money so he can buy a lorry like Jacobus. And when he sleeps, the dreams of a happy moment of wealth and pleasure after the strike. In other words, Njoroge's dreams are totally childish and unrelated to reality. His expectations of the strike are wider off the mark. On the eve of the strike, with his mothers worried about Ngoto's safety, Njoroge falls on his knees and prays to the God of Abraham and Isaac. And the readers can hardly refrain from believing that ngugi wa thiong'o is satirizing him, and through him, all Africans who remain passive in the belief that the God of Abraham will solve their problems for them. In an important conversation with a very worried Nwahaki, at the time she is feeling very isolated because of her father's position as chief, all Njoroge can offer the anxious girl is a tried belief in the righteousness of God, but she quite intelligently wonders why a just God does not put an end to a country's suffering. Laughably, he sees himself as God's anointed comforter, who offers the hope that sunshine always follows a darker night. Onwahaki sees no foundation for his callous optimism, responds rather mockingly, "Tomorrow, tomorrow never comes. I would rather think of today." It is in this scene, which foreshadows their final meeting at the end of the novel, that she suggests they should escape to another country. He rebuts the idea because, in his view, he will be running away from the mission God has appointed to him to be the comforter of his people. In their last meeting, before he goes off to Syriana, he offers her the same vision of a brighter tomorrow in response to her fears about the bloodletting of the emergency. But she responds with skepticism. You are always talking about tomorrow. Tomorrow. You are always talking about the country and the people. What is tomorrow? And what is the country and the people to you? And Njoroge responds that without belief in the eventual coming of God's warmth and purity, all they will have is a present darkness, and which means that life is meaningless. Surely, this darkness and terror will not go on forever. And finally, she seems to accept his message of hope, and yet, as they part, she seems to wipe a tear from her cheek. Perhaps she is not convinced by his glib optimism. Syriana, the missionary secondary school, offers Njoroge further opportunity to indulge in his visionary and escapist dreams. The school itself was an abode of peace in a turbulent country. Here, it was possible to meet with God, not only in the cool shelter of the temple, where he spends many hours, but also in the quietness of the library. The reader wonders if Njoroge is ever going to be shaking off his unrealistic Christian dreams, whether this silly boy will ever wake up to the reality around him. The answer comes soon enough, with his arrest, detention, and torture, which are followed by the death of his father, the imprisonment of his brother, and the coming execution of his other brother. He himself, taken out of Syriana, is reduced to working for a while in an Indian shop, as his illiterate father has done all those years. He has his two mothers to feed at this dark time, so losing the job is a heavy blow. Nwahaki, the love of his life, is his last hope for happiness, for at this time, he seems finally to have lost faith in the God of Abraham. His final meeting with Nwahaki is awkward. It is his brother, after all, who murders her father. Ever the escapist, he proposes earnestly that they should run away to Uganda. And ever the realist, she turns him down. She cannot abandon her widowed mother. She is clearly more courageous than him and is prepared to embrace the difficulties of today in hope of a better tomorrow. She adopts more realistically the message he has only superficially bandied about. Shattered, he tries to kill himself, but is stopped in an act by his mother. Finally, he wakes up to his responsibility, confronts his cowardice, and opens the door to their dwellings for his two mothers. What does the ending mean? For one thing, the two young survivors must undertake the major responsibility of keeping their shattered families intact and of contributing to rebuilding of the community when the situation permits. Fortunately, they are aware now in a way that they were not before of their real responsibility to others. They should come together again. As is likely, their love will be selfless. They will support each other as they work for the benefit of their families and their community. Dear viewers, in this final chapter, we have concerned ourselves with the lessons one can learn from Ngugi wa Thiong'o's novel, Weep Not Child. The novel, as we have seen, expands the experience of the readers by making him or her sensitively aware of how it felt to live through the emergency in Kenya. The reader is made to feel the poverty of the landless Africans, the relative affluence of the middle-class African, the illegitimate wealth of the white settler. Further, the reader is shown how some Africans were radicalized by the appalling injustice, leading to the start of a guerrilla war against the settler. Finally, the reader is shown how the emergency shattered the lives and dreams of all sections of the population. Thanks for watching this video. Please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share this video.